Chapter 5, Knockoff. How was your first day at your new school? Mrs. Smith trilled as soon as Delia trudged through the front door. Delia had taken the train home, the L as it was called in Chicago. It was an elevated train, which meant that unlike in other cities, which had mostly underground subway stops, the platforms where you waited were above the street. You were completely exposed to Chicago's punishing recipe of wind, rain, sleet, and snow, depending on the day. On this day, the sky had pelted her with a wintry mix of rain and ice, while the wind tore through her old coat. She was going to need a new one of those too. By the time she got home, she was shivering and miserable. The perfect end to her very not perfect day. Horrifying, Delia groaned, slamming her backpack down for emphasis. No, worse than that. Horrendous, horrible, hideous. Got any more? You forgot horrific, Mrs. Smith said, unable to contain a chuckle. Perfect, Delia said, plopping down on the sofa in a funk. And it's not funny. My new school is awful. I miss my old school, and I miss my old friends. It's not the same without Zoe and Aaliyah. Well, I've got something that will make it all better, Mrs. Smith said, then lowered her voice. Just don't tell your mother. We both know she doesn't approve of sweets before dinner. Where is she anyway? Delia asked, glancing around the townhouse for any sign of her mom, even though she suspected that she already knew the answer. No purse and overcoat piled on the kitchen table. No neutral pumps cast off by the front door. No smell of her sweet baby powder-scented perfume wafting through the house. She wasn't here. Her mother always worked long hours with her new law firm job, the one that had enabled them to move in with Mrs. Smith in the nicer part of town. She often missed dinner altogether, or rushed home just in time, bursting through the door in a blast of cold, wintry air, breathless and clutching, steaming takeout containers, only to gobble down food like it was her first meal of the day, and then vanish into her bedroom to take night classes online. The steady clack, clack, clack of her keyboard would echo out. It was a signal to not interrupt her. Of course, Delia loved her mother and appreciated how hard she worked, especially as a single mother who had to support their little family on her own. But often, Delia found herself wishing she had the kind of mother who could stay home and bake chocolate chip cookies and greet her when she got back from school in the afternoons, like some of her friends had. Not that baking cookies was her mother's strong suit, even if she did have more time. It was her father's fault in a way. Delia understood that, but blaming him was like blaming some invisible force or just thin air. She had no real concept of him or what he was even like as a person. All she knew was that her mom believed they were better off without him. But were they really? Delia didn't always know. She glanced at the clock, guessing her mom would be home late again. She's still at work, Mrs. Smith said, following Delia's gaze. The clock ticked away the afternoon, which was quickly transforming into evening. In winter, the sun set extra early. But she's picking up pizzas on her way home, and then she has classes online tonight. With that, almost as an apology, Mrs. Smith handed Delia a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Tiny, pillowy marshmallows floated on the top of the rich, frothy concoction. Thanks, Mrs. Smith, Delia said morosely, so she wouldn't have much time tonight to beg her mother for the boots. All the horrible things that had happened at school flashed through her mind again. Harper and her friends teasing her and laughing at her clothes. She felt so naive for thinking she could just waltz into gilded crests looking like that and make friends with the most popular girls at the school. If her mom was right, and first impressions mattered that much, then she'd sealed her fate today. But she didn't want to give up. If she could somehow get a pair of the House of DeVille boots, then maybe she could change her minds about her and make friends. Or, at the very least, fit in better and not get teased so much. Just thinking about their jeering taunts made her heart sink. Still, as soon as she took a whiff of the hot cocoa, her mood lightened the tiniest bit. Mrs. Smith always had a way of cheering her up, even when it felt impossible. Anyway, I simply don't agree with the sweets rule, Mrs. Smith said with an approving smile. Your mother means well, of course, but chocolate is practically its own food group, and it's appropriate any time of the day. Or night, if you ask me. Delia laughed in spite of her terrible mood. Don't worry, my lips are sealed. The mug warmed her hands. It'll be our little secret. She sipped the hot chocolate and closed her eyes. It was rich and heavenly. The warm liquid ran down her throat, coating her tongue and heating her from the inside out. She sighed with relief. Mrs. Smith was the perfect counterbalance to her mother's strict rules. Delia often felt annoyed at them. Well, more like all the time. But she knew that her mom was just trying to be a good parent, even if she went overboard at times, and probably in some way to make up for her father not sticking around. There now, my dear, Mrs. Smith said, nodding as Delia inhaled the hot cocoa like it was medicine. Chocolate has a way of making everything better, doesn't it? It sure does, Delia thought. She wandered over to the litter of puppies, who seemed to have sprouted more black spots while she was at school. They also seemed to have grown an inch each. Look, they're growing up so fast, Delia said, pointing to the new spots. The dogs were clearly thriving here, but that meant they'd be leaving sooner rather than later for their adoptive homes. Delia put down her mug and snagged Radar by his neck, then cradled him in her arms, already missing him. As if reading her mind, Radar licked her face, then nibbled at her nose. She smelled his sweet puppy breath and smiled. Puppies liked you no matter what boots you wore, or how frizzy your hair was, or how many likes you got on Pick Perfect that day. Suddenly, the phone rang in the kitchen, the old rotary one. It sounded like a fire alarm. Coming! Hold your horses, Mrs. Smith called out. She snagged the phone, holding it to her ear. Hello? She listened, then said, How did you get this number? I'm sorry, we're not interested. Don't call here again. Then she slammed the receiver down angrily. Who is that? Delia asked, looking over in alarm. What did they want? Mrs. Smith rarely raised her voice, so her reaction to the call was surprising. Can you believe it? Mrs. Smith said. Somebody was trying to buy the puppies. But how did they even know about them? Delia asked. I guess the rescue listed them as available for adoption, Mrs. Smith said. But they're sorely mistaken. We don't sell puppies. We adopt them out to loving homes. Only after a rigorous application and thorough house inspection. Well, did you tell him to apply to adopt the puppy? Delia asked. No, you don't understand, Mrs. Smith said, wringing her hands. They didn't just want one puppy. They wanted to buy all of them. Somebody wants to buy the whole litter? Delia said in shock. She glanced over at the pen. They were cute, now, for sure. But they'd only get bigger and bigger and transform into rambunctious, full-grown dogs. But why would they want that many puppies? No idea, Mrs. Smith said, but they belong in a loving adopted home. We're not in the puppy sales business. That's just wrong. It goes against everything we stand for. Delia felt a surge of affection for her landlady. That's right. You belong with us, she whispered to Radar, petting his head. Then she set him back in the pen. Don't worry, we're not going to sell you. We'll find a good adoptive home for you and your brothers and sisters. Just then, the front door flew open, and Delia's mom rushed through, carrying pizzas and a wrapped box. The bitter wind whipped through the townhouse until she slammed the door. Sorry I'm late, Mom said, out of breath. Her cheeks were red and flushed from the cold. But I do have a special surprise. Really? What is it? Delia said. Oh, I simply love surprises, Mrs. Smith added, clutching at her skirt. Mom plopped the pizzas on the counter, then thrust the wrapped gift at Delia. The box was big enough to hold a pair of boots. Delia's heart started to race. Could it actually be the House of DeVille's boots? Mom, what is it? Delia asked, hardly daring to hope. She turned the box over in her hands. Her excitement was so strong and pure, she could actually taste it on her tongue. A special gift from my special student, Mom said. I got your text. Oh, no way! Really? Delia squealed, clutching the box. I know our budget has been tight lately, Mom went on, but I wanted to do something special for you, since it was your first day at a new school. Plus, you do need them. Those are getting old. Delia's old boots sat by the door, looking worn and soggy. Well, what are you waiting for? Mom said, clasping her hands together eagerly. Go ahead. Open it up. Delia tore off the wrapping paper. She lifted the lid and her eyes landed on a pair of black and white boots, lined with tufts of faux fur. She couldn't believe it. Her heart soared. This was the answer to all her problems. Mom, this is incredible. Where did you get them? Delia's mother beamed. Well, I couldn't believe it, but I found them at Replay Vintage. According to the shopkeeper, I got really lucky. They're super popular right now. Oh, thank you so much, Delia said, unable to believe her change of luck. She lifted the boots out of the box and immediately noticed the label. House of DeVille. No. This couldn't be happening. They were knockoff boots, a cheap imitation, not the real thing. Worse yet, they were clearly used. The fur inside was crushed down, while the soles were worn and scuffed up, and they had a smell like somebody else's feet had been inside them. Mom, aren't they glad? Mom said, oblivious. She peered at Delia excitedly. Go ahead, try them on and model them for us. Mom, they're the wrong brand, Delia said, feeling dismayed. Her mother looked confused. She glanced at Mrs. Smith for help. But they're House of DeVille, she said, pointing to the logo on the box. That's what you wanted. They look exactly like that picture you texted me. No, they don't, Delia thought, making a mental list of all the imperfections, the cheap plastic soles, the leaching color of the faux fur. I asked for House of DeVille, Delia said, enunciating carefully. These are a knockoff. Mom sighed in exasperation. What's the difference? Nobody will be able to tell. They look exactly the same. No, they don't, Delia said. It's obvious they're a cheap copy. Everyone at school will know we can't afford the real thing. There's no way I can wear these out of the house. A smile finally fell off her mother's face. That's enough, young lady, she snapped. You sound like a spoiled little brat. I raised you better than this. Even Miss Smith shook her head at Delia's tantrum. But they didn't understand. Why couldn't they see that these boots weren't the real thing? And worse yet, would probably get her teased at school even more mercilessly than she already had been. She simply couldn't wear them. She would rather die. Harper was right. They couldn't afford the real thing. It was hopeless. She was never going to fit in that gilded crest. You're wearing them to school tomorrow, Mom said, and that's final. They're perfectly good boots. I spent hard-earned money on them. Delia threw the box down in anger. But Mom! But nothing, Mom snapped back. Now pick that box up. There's a gift card in it for the thrift shop, so you can pick out a new winter coat after school tomorrow, too. Your coat is getting old, and there's a blizzard forecast to hit this week. A new coat? Delia said, feeling tears prick her eyes. Everything in that stupid store is old and used. For once, I wish I could get something that's actually new. New things are a waste of money when you can get perfectly good clothing at half the price, Mom said in a stern voice. One day, when you have to pick work to pay for things, you'll understand. No, I won't. I'll never understand, Delia thought, pouting. And I want you to get something warm and practical, her mother railed on. It's going to be a long, bitter winter, according to the weather forecast. Practical meant one thing. Ugly. Could it get any worse? A hideous coat to go with her knockoff boots? But Delia knew better than to argue more. That would only get her grounded. And worse yet, she'd lose her phone, the only good thing left in her life. It was the only way she could stay on Pick Perfect and connected to her old friends. In short, it was her lifeline. Fine, she said quietly. All right, good. Now that that's settled, want some pizza? Mom said, trying to break the tension. I got veggie, your favorite. No thanks, Delia said in a mopey voice. I'm not hungry. Her mother exchanged a look with Mrs. Smith, but they both knew better than to push the issue. Okay, have it your way, Mom replied with a frown. It'll be in the fridge if you get hungry later. Delia retreated to her room with the boots and gift card, feeling utterly defeated, and slammed her door. At least she could message her old friends about how unfair her mother was being. Alia and Zoe would totally understand. They'd get her mom was the one who was acting totally crazy and unreasonable, not the other way around. Everyone her age knew that knockoffs weren't the same thing, so why couldn't her mother understand? Delia flopped on her bed and opened Pick Perfect to a flood of hearts. Her heart raced excitedly when she saw them. I got comments on my post. But then she opened the app, her eyes falling on a slew of red devil faces in the comments under the pic wishing for the House of DeVille boots, pushing her profile further down the ranks. But it got worse when her eyes fell on which users had left the devils on her post. It was Harper, Charlotte, and Ella, the glam posse. Their bullying wasn't confined to the school halls. It had moved online too. The other comments came from kids at Gilded Crest who she didn't even know, but who must have noticed Harper and her friends leaving devil comments on Delia's post. Delia scrolled down her feed in horror. The devil faces left by her classmates seemed to laugh at her, taunting her. You're not Pick Perfect, they seemed to say. Delia felt more tears prick her eyes, then fall down her cheeks and plop on her phone screen, blurring the images. Meanwhile, Harper's hashtag House of DeVille selfie continued to trend at #1 for her school. This was undoubtedly the worst day of her life, from feeling completely out of place at her new school to getting teased by Harper and her friends, to her mom buying her knockoff boots, to the devil comments on her Pick Perfect post. And it wasn't over yet. I have to wear those horrible boots tomorrow, she thought, before she fell into a restless, hungry sleep. Delia ran through the school hallways as voices chased after her. The halls in this place were like a maze. She had to get to class, but she couldn't find the way. "You're going to be marked tardy, young lady." The headmaster's voice echoed around her. Something heavy landed at her feet. It was the Gilded Crest Academy Student Code of Conduct. The book flipped open on its own, the pages fluttering. It landed on the chapter marked Grounds for Student Expulsion. Delia backed away in horror, then bolted for the front door. At least she thought she was heading for the front door. Everything looked the same. The lockers around her flew open, their metal doors crashing, and hands reached out to grab her. Their fingernails manicured, trendy jewelry dripping from their wrists. "Charity case. We wouldn't be caught dead in those boots." "Loser! Loser!" Cackling laughter surrounded her, making her sweat and bringing tears to her eyes. Delia bolted into the bathroom and dove into a stall, shutting the door and latching it. Her breath burst out in raged gasps. She reached down to tug off her horrible boots, pulling hard, but they wouldn't come off. The boots stayed stuck to her feet as if superglued to her soles. She pulled harder, but no matter what she did, they wouldn't come off. Bang! Delia jumped back. Someone had pounded on the stall door, but she hadn't heard anyone come into the bathroom. Who's there?" she stammered, pulling at the boots. Bang! 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 Could there be more than one person out there? Why were they all chasing her? What had she done wrong? "Please, leave me alone," Delia pleaded, tears running down her cheeks. She pushed down at the boots from the top. She tried to pry them off from underneath. She even tried to rip off the already torn sole, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a tall, shadowy figure rose up behind her, cackling. Delia whipped around in terror. The figure had short, spiky hair that flew wildly in all directions. "You're not fashionable enough to fit in here,"